Picture this: a single burial rite, lost to time, setting off a chain reaction of bloodshed and economic chaos across continents. It sounds like something out of a dark fantasy, but in the medieval world, this was reality. When empires forgot the sacred customs of the dead, they didn't just lose traditions, they unleashed diplomatic disasters. Trade routes crumbled, alliances shattered, and wars were fought over misunderstandings as simple as how to lay a body to rest. This is the strange, untold story of how the dead wielded power over the living, turning forgotten rituals into deadly political weapons. Think about the last time you misunderstood someone's intentions, maybe a misplaced word or a gesture taken the wrong way. Now multiply that by empires, armies, and centuries of cultural drift. That's what happened when medieval rulers stumbled over burial rites they no longer recognized. A relic misplaced, a funeral rite performed incorrectly. These weren't just oversights. They were insults, betrayals, acts of war in the eyes of those who still remembered the old ways. And in a world where trade depended on trust, even small slights could topple economies. Silk, spices, and gold flowed along routes guarded by tradition, and when those traditions were broken, the consequences were catastrophic. So how did something as solemn as honoring the dead become a spark for conflict? The answer lies in the fragile web of medieval diplomacy, where every ritual was a language, every custom a contract. Empires rose and fell, but the dead and the ways they were laid to rest held a grip on the living that no one could escape. Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel how these forgotten rites rewrote history, from the markets of Constantinople to the ports of Venice. You'll see how a single misinterpreted funeral could drain a kingdom's coffers, and why even the mightiest rulers feared the ghosts of traditions they'd left behind. This isn't just a tale of the past, it's a lesson in how easily the threads of memory, when cut, can unravel the world. The power of burial rites in medieval trade wasn't just symbolic, it was written in ledgers and treaties. Take the Byzantine Empire's trade embargo against Venice in the 10th century. When Venetian merchants allegedly mishandled the relics of St. Mark during transport, Constantinople didn't just send angry letters. They shut down Venetian access to the Silk Road's eastern terminals, cutting off the flow of Byzantine gold and silks for years. This wasn't mere punishment, it was economic warfare waged with funeral spices and sacred bones. What made these rituals so valuable? Imagine burial customs as medieval copyright laws. The right to prepare a body with myrrh and frankincense, to wrap it in specific linens, to place certain artifacts in the grave. These weren't arbitrary traditions. They were intellectual property, fiercely guarded trade secrets passed down through generations. A funeral director in Alexandria might control recipes for embalming resins that Cairo's merchants needed for elite burials, creating monopolies as powerful as any modern corporation. Even burial locations became economic chess pieces. When the Holy Roman Empire claimed sole rights to bury nobility in consecrated Teutonic soil, it forced Scandinavian traders to pay steep funeral tariffs to inter their dead near pilgrimage sites. These weren't religious fees, they were clever trade barriers disguised as piety. A Norwegian merchant might pay 10 times the price for a burial plot in Mainz simply because his ancestors hadn't negotiated the right funerary clauses in old treaties. The most surprising twist: some cultures weaponized burial taboos. Islamic caliphates under the Abbasids would deliberately misplace Christian relics during negotiations, knowing European traders would forfeit favorable terms to recover them. One documented case shows Genoese merchants accepting 30% less for their wool exports, just to retrieve a single saint's finger bone from a Damascus bazaar. In this world, grave goods weren't just offerings to the afterlife, they were bargaining chips for the living. Perhaps no example proves this better than the Baltic amber trade. Prussian tribes controlled Europe's richest amber deposits, but they wouldn't sell to just anyone. Buyers had to participate in elaborate funeral ceremonies, drinking from ceremonial cups placed in burial mounds. Those who refused found their trade routes mysteriously collapsing, ships sunk, caravans raided. Archaeologists now recognize these funeral licenses as early trade agreements, written not on parchment but in shared ritual. When the Teutonic Knights later conquered Prussia, their first act wasn't changing taxes, it was rewriting burial codes to control the amber flow. This intricate system worked until empires grew careless. As Mongol hordes and crusaders redrew maps, new rulers often dismissed old funeral customs as superstition. But in doing so, they accidentally tore up the invisible contracts that had kept trade moving for centuries. When the Khwarezmian Empire ignored Seljuk burial protocols while transporting goods through Anatolia, they didn't just offend local priests, they triggered a trade war that choked off Persian silk routes for decades. The lesson was clear. In medieval commerce, the dead held the keys to the treasury. One misplaced gesture, one misunderstood silence. In the medieval world, these weren't just social blunders. They were economic catastrophes waiting to happen. Take that Frankish merchant in 12th century Cairo. When he dared to conduct business during the local mourning period for a revered imam, he didn't just offend his hosts, he shattered an unspoken rule binding commerce to cosmic cycles. The punishment was swift and severe, an 8-year ban on all Frankish traders from Egyptian markets. This wasn't petty retaliation. To medieval minds, disrupting mourning rituals risked inviting calamity upon entire cities. Slavic tribes took this belief even further. When Germanic traders cremated their dead contrary to Slavic customs using the wrong woods or omitting specific grave offerings, the response wasn't negotiation. It was immediate severance of all trade ties. Why such drastic measures? Because for these cultures, proper burial wasn't just about respect, it was about maintaining balance between worlds. Chronicles from Novgorod describe crop failures and mysterious livestock deaths following improper foreign funerals, events interpreted as the dead themselves punishing the living. The fear of cosmic consequences turned trade disputes into existential crises. Byzantine records tell of a Venetian ship seized not for carrying contraband, but because sailors had thrown burial shrouds overboard to lighten their load during a storm. To Constantinople's merchants, this wasn't pragmatism, it was an invitation for vengeful spirits to follow the goods back to port. The ship's entire cargo of Syrian glass was confiscated and ritually cleansed, costing its owners a fortune. Even natural disasters became entangled in these burial conflicts. When the Great Famine of 1184 struck northern Europe, Cistercian monks didn't blame poor harvests or bad weather. Their chronicles point squarely to Saxon traders who had buried their dead without the required iron tools, an oversight believed to have angered the earth itself. The resulting trade embargo lasted until every improperly buried body was exhumed and reburied with correct rites. What seems like superstition to modern eyes was, in its time, a sophisticated economic safeguard. These rituals functioned as early quality controls. A merchant who respected local burial customs was far more likely to honor trade agreements. The meticulous preparation of bodies mirrored the care expected in business dealings. Skip steps in one, and you might cut corners in the other. When Genoese traders began omitting traditional coin placements in graves while also shortchanging Baltic partners on amber weights, the connection seemed obvious to medieval observers. The most fascinating aspect, some cultures turned these beliefs into brilliant negotiation tactics. Islamic traders in Al-Andalus would deliberately pause negotiations during Christian feast days, knowing their Castilian counterparts interpreted continued talks during sacred periods as bad omens. This psychological leverage secured better terms on everything from olive oil to Toledo steel. Meanwhile, Norse merchants sailing the Volga adjusted their entire trade calendars around Slavic ancestor veneration months, not out of piety, but because goods transported during quiet times fetched premium prices from buyers fearing ghostly interference. These conflicts reveal a truth far deeper than medieval peculiarity. In a world without standardized contracts or international courts, burial rites became the ultimate binding agreement, a sacred promise that if broken carried consequences no ledger could quantify. When the King of Hungary demanded Bohemian merchants stop cremating their dead near his borders in 1261, it wasn't about theology. It was about protecting what we'd now call supply chain stability. His decree put it plainly: the smoke of wrong fires brings storms to honest markets. The theft of St. Mark's bones from Alexandria wasn't just a daring heist, it was Venice's masterstroke in the medieval game of economic thrones. Imagine an entire city's wealth hinging on a single set of remains. That was the reality for medieval port cities, where relics weren't just objects of veneration but the ultimate tourist attractions. When Venetian merchants smuggled St. Mark's body out of Egypt in the 9th century, they weren't merely securing spiritual prestige. They were redirecting the flow of pilgrim silver-like merchants diverting a river. This was no isolated incident. Across Europe, the trade in sacred bones followed ruthless market logic. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa didn't conquer Milan in 1162 for territory alone. He seized the bones of the three kings from its cathedral. Overnight, Cologne became the must-visit destination for European pilgrims, while Milan's innkeepers and relic sellers faced ruin. The message was clear: control the saints, control the economy. Some relics commanded prices that would stagger modern art collectors. When French knights captured Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, they didn't just loot gold, they auctioned off fragments of the true cross to Venetian bankers as collateral for war debts. A single rib from St. Nicholas, yes, the original Santa Claus, was traded between Genoa and Bari for exclusive port rights in the Adriatic. These weren't spiritual transactions, they were high-stakes business deals wrapped in holy vestments. The most brilliant part, the relic trade created medieval franchise systems. A cathedral acquiring a saint's finger wouldn't hoard it. They'd lease fragments to smaller churches across their region, collecting annual fees while maintaining spiritual authority. The Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris operated what we'd now call a relic licensing program, certifying authenticity for a percentage of pilgrimage revenues. Forgeries flourished accordingly. Medieval church ledgers are filled with complaints about multiplication miracles, where two cathedrals claimed possession of the same saint's head. But the real power of relics lay in their ability to enforce trade alliances. When the Byzantine Empire wanted to punish Amalfi for supporting Norman invaders, they didn't send armies. They revoked the Italian city's rights to venerate St. Andrew's relics in Constantinople. The economic shock was immediate. Amalfitan ships suddenly found themselves barred from Byzantine ports, their merchants unable to compete with rivals who still had relic-backed trading privileges. Perhaps no case shows this better than the bizarre War of the Holy Foreskin. Yes, you heard right. Multiple European churches claimed to possess Christ's circumcised skin, using it to attract pilgrims. When Charlemagne allegedly gifted one such relic to Rome, it came with strings attached. Any kingdom recognizing this relic's authenticity gained preferential trading rights with the Papal States. Centuries later, when the Holy Roman Empire tried to move the same relic to Prague, it sparked diplomatic incidents with France that disrupted the wool trade for years. These sacred objects became medieval nuclear options in trade disputes. A threatening letter from one ruler to another might include not just words, but a lock of hair from a shared patron saint, a nun too, subtle reminder that economic warfare could escalate to spiritual annihilation. When King Louis IX of France purchased Christ's crown of thorns from cash-strapped Byzantine emperors, he wasn't just building Saint Chapelle as a shrine. He was positioning Paris as Europe's new spiritual and commercial capital, diverting both pilgrims and their money away from rivals. The relic trade's legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Modern licensing laws and intellectual property disputes trace their roots to these medieval battles over sacred authenticity. The next time you see two businesses fighting over a trademark or patent, remember, it's not so different from 13th century bishops arguing over who really owned St. Peter's kneecap. In both cases, control of the real thing meant control of the money flowing toward it. What made these ancient bones so powerful wasn't their supernatural properties, but the economic ecosystems they supported. A single relic could sustain entire industries, from candle makers supplying votive lights to scribes producing pilgrimage certificates. When the Bishop of Trier unveiled his collection of St. Peter's sandals in the 1200s, he didn't just attract worshippers. He created jobs for relic authenticators, souvenir vendors, and even counterfeit detectors. The system finally collapsed under its own weight. By the late Middle Ages, the overabundance of dubious relics, multiple heads of John the Baptist, enough fragments of the true cross to build a ship, led to widespread skepticism. But for centuries, these sacred objects functioned as the ultimate medieval commodity, proving that in the clash between faith and finance, money usually had the last word. The next time someone calls modern commerce cutthroat, remind them of the merchant who traded 3 shiploads of grain for a saint's tooth and called it a bargain. The funeral feast was more than a gathering, it was a signed contract written in mead and roasted meat. In medieval Scandinavia, kings didn't send diplomats to negotiate trade deals, they sent invitations to burial banquets. A seat at the table wasn't optional. When German merchants from Lübeck skipped King Haakon V's memorial feast in 1314, they didn't just miss a meal, they breached what Norse law called the Covenant of the Cup. Within weeks, Norwegian harbors slammed shut to Hanseatic ships, and Bergen's fish markets sat empty while Lübeck's warehouses spoiled with unsold grain. What made these feasts so binding? Picture them as medieval stock exchanges where drinking horns replaced signing pens. Each toast was a clause, each shared dish a term sheet. Saga accounts describe Viking traders sealing deals by placing butter on the grave of a mutual ancestor, a gesture that meant, may our partnership outlast even death. Skip the butter and you voided the agreement. By the High Middle Ages, this evolved into elaborate funeral feasts with precise menus. Serving smoked reindeer meant renewing northern trade routes. Omitting Baltic herring signaled embargo. The stakes were highest for the Hanseatic League, whose entire business model relied on these edible contracts. German merchants knew the rules. Attend a Swedish king's funeral feast, and you kept access to iron mines. Miss a Danish queen's memorial, and suddenly your ships needed costly mourning permits to pass through the Sound. In 1376, when Visby's merchants failed to send representatives to King Albert's funeral, the resulting trade freeze collapsed Gotland's amber market for a generation. But the true brilliance of these feasts lay in their unspoken enforcement. No treaties needed renewing when the terms were baked into ritual. A Norwegian law from 1291 states plainly, "He who refuses the funeral ale refuses the silver." Archaeologists find proof in harbor ruins layers of abandoned trade goods precisely dated to periods when feasts were skipped. Excavations at Birka revealed Venetian glass buried beneath Norse soil, untouched because the merchants who brought it had insulted a jarl's funeral. The system worked until cultural shifts turned tradition into traps. As Christian reforms swept Scandinavia, new clergy condemned funeral feasts as pagan holdovers. German traders, now more attuned to papal decrees than Norse custom, began declining invitations. The consequences were catastrophic. When Lübeck's council banned its merchants from attending King Eric's funeral in 1429, Sweden retaliated by cancelling all Hanseatic copper mining rights. The League's ledgers show a 60% drop in metal exports that year, all because of uneaten roast boar. Some rulers weaponized this disconnect. Danish kings exploited Hanseatic reluctance by scheduling funeral feasts during Lent, knowing Catholic merchants would refuse meat. The result, pretexts to levy penitence tariffs on German ships. A single missed feast in 1462 cost Rostock's merchants their monopoly on Icelandic fish, a loss so devastating it sparked riots in the city's harbor district. Yet the most fascinating twist came from those who adapted. Smart Hanseatic factors hired local Norse proxies to attend feasts in their stead, creating the first professional funeral guests. These mourning agents would drink, feast, and crucially sign receipts proving contractual compliance. Records from Bergen showed German warehouses employing full-time ale witnesses whose sole job was attending funerals to maintain trade privileges. It was medieval outsourcing at its most inventive until a scandal erupted in 1487. When Danish authorities discovered Lübeck's agents were secretly watering down their ritual drinks. The legacy of these feasts lingers in modern business culture. That obligatory post-conference dinner, the networking cocktail hour, they're descendants of Norse funeral economics, where breaking bread still means sealing deals. The next time you force down rubbery chicken at a corporate event, remember, 700 years ago, that dry-in tray could have cost your entire company its trading rights. Some traditions, it seems, are harder to bury than others. Burial grounds weren't just sacred spaces. They were medieval customs houses with tombstones as border markers. Take that Genoese merchant colony in Crimea during the 1400s. When Italian traders began burying their dead on a hillside overlooking the Black Sea, Moscow didn't see grieving families, they saw a creeping territorial claim written in marble epitaphs. Within months, Russian officials imposed crushing new tariffs on Genoese silk caravans, not because of the goods they carried, but because each grave was interpreted as a permanent stake in the land. The message was clear: soil that held your ancestors would soon demand your taxes. This was no isolated misunderstanding. Across the Mediterranean, Muslim and Christian traders waged silent wars through cemetery placement. In Norman Sicily, riots erupted when Palermo's Christian nobles accidentally built a churchyard over an old Muslim burial ground. On the surface, it seemed like a clerical error, but to Sicilian Arab merchants, this was economic sabotage. Their ancestors' graves had marked tax-exempt zones under old trade treaties. Cover them with Christian crosses, and suddenly their goods faced Venetian-level import duties. The resulting violence wasn't just about religious desecration, it was about preserving centuries-old commercial loopholes. Some rulers turned graveyards into brilliant economic traps. The kings of Hungary deliberately granted burial rights to German miners in Transylvania, knowing their descendants would keep paying ancestral fees to work the same silver veins. Venetian doges took it further. Their burial island of San Michele wasn't just a resting place, but a clever way to claim territorial waters. Any ship passing near the cemetery had to pay harbor taxes, as the graves proved Venetian dominion over the Adriatic currents. The most ruthless play came from the Teutonic Knights in Prussia. They mandated that all foreign merchants bury their dead in designated trade cemeteries outside city walls. But here's the catch: each grave required annual maintenance payments to the order. Fail to pay, and your ancestors were disinterred, voiding your trading privileges. Ledgers from Gdansk show Hanseatic merchants paying more in grave fees than port taxes, all to keep access to the amber trade. It was medieval subscription economics: pay to keep your dead buried, or lose your living income. Even the placement of individual graves held financial weight. In Alexandria, Coptic Christian traders secured lower spice tariffs by ensuring their burial plots neighbored those of influential Muslim jurists, a subtle claim of communal ties. Constantinople's Armenian merchants famously paid premium prices for graves near imperial mausoleums, knowing proximity to royalty meant lighter customs inspections. A single well-placed tombstone could save a dynasty's worth of gold in trade duties. The system collapsed when empires stopped seeing graves as contracts. As Protestant reforms swept Europe, new ideas about burial stripped cemeteries of their economic power. No longer were ancestors passive guarantors of trade rights; they became simply the dead. But for nearly 1,000 years, a merchant's final resting place wasn't just about eternity. It was the ultimate long-term investment in their family's fortune. The next time you walk past an old cemetery, look closer. Those weathered stones might just be faded copies of medieval tax returns, etched in stone instead of parchment. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway of commerce, it was a gauntlet of ghosts, where the wrong funeral could haunt your ledger for generations. Picture a caravan of Persian silk merchants stranded at a Mongol outpost, their richest bales untouched because one trader had died mid-journey. According to custom, his body should have been washed with sacred waters before continuing, but the Mongols left him as he fell, unpurified, his spirit unguided. To Persian buyers back in Baghdad, this wasn't just negligence. It rendered every bolt of silk in that caravan spiritually contaminated, a mobile grave that could curse entire marketplaces. Overnight, Mongol wool and Persian silk markets froze in mutual suspicion, with each side blaming the other for violating the unseen rules of the road. What seems like superstition was actually sophisticated risk management. Medieval traders operated on razor-thin margins, where one failed shipment could bankrupt a dynasty. By avoiding regions with unfamiliar burial customs, they weren't being irrational, they were mitigating what we'd now call supply chain vulnerabilities. Chinese records from the Tang dynasty describe entire merchant guilds rerouting around Tibet not because of bandits but because sky burials, leaving corpses for vultures, made their Hindu partners refuse to handle goods from that route. The logic was mercilessly practical. Why risk your reputation selling merchandise that buyers feared was tainted by unquiet spirits? Some trade networks encoded these fears into law. The Radhanite Jews, who dominated Europe to China trade for centuries, had strict contracts stipulating how deceased colleagues must be handled. Their ledgers show cargoes abandoned rather than transported with improperly buried bodies, even if it meant swallowing the loss. A 12th century court case in Alexandria reveals Venetian spice merchants suing a ship's captain not for sinking their pepper, but for throwing a dead sailor overboard without the required linen shroud, an act believed to doom the entire voyage's profits. The captain lost the case and his license, proving that in medieval commerce, spiritual hygiene mattered as much as fiscal hygiene, the most fascinating wrinkle. How cultures weaponized these beliefs. When the Ilkhanate Mongols wanted to pressure Armenian silk traders, They didn't raise taxes, they deliberately left Christian corpses unburied along trade routes, knowing the sight would deter competitors. Genoese merchants retaliated by spreading rumors that Mongol burial sites were commercially haunted, causing even neutral traders to avoid their caravans. This psychological warfare reached its peak when a single misinterpreted funeral in Samarkand sparked a chain reaction of embargoes that collapsed the Central Asian jade trade for 7 years. Archaeology confirms the economic fallout. Excavations along abandoned Silk Road branches reveal clusters of untouched merchant graves near thriving towns, not markers of plague or war, but of deliberate avoidance. A Byzantine trading post in Crimea was found with its warehouses still packed with unsold indigo, abandoned after local tribes buried a chief with commerce-disrupting rites. The site's ledger tablets tell the story in dry numbers. No sales this season, the dead walk the market, yet for all its strangeness, this system had a grim logic. In an era without quality control inspections or standardized contracts, burial customs functioned as a universal trust signal. A merchant who honored the dead properly was far more likely to honor his debts. When the Mamluks accused Venetian traders of skimping on funeral rites in 1423, they weren't just making religious accusations, they were declaring them financially unreliable. The resulting ban on Venetian goods in Cairo lasted until the Doge sent a delegation to rebury every Venetian corpse in Egypt with full Islamic rites. The lesson echoes into modern commerce. Today's supply chain managers fret over tariffs, but medieval traders faced something far more volatile: the invisible hand of the afterlife. One Kashmiri merchant's journal puts it best: better to lose 1,000 dinars to bandits than one bolt of silk to bad graves, because while money could be repaid, a cursed reputation could outlive empires and the merchants who crossed them. The Vatican's parchment loopholes might have been the ultimate medieval get-out-of-jail-free cards if the price was right. When Pope Innocent III began selling burial indulgences in 1200, he wasn't just offering spiritual comfort. These handwritten passes allowed merchants to sidestep local funeral laws for a fee, creating a wholly black market where sacred tradition met cold, hard cash. Marseille's wine traders were among the first to exploit the system. By flashing papal permits that excused them from Frankish burial customs, they avoided costly funeral tariffs on their shipments. But this wasn't just clever accounting. It was spiritual insider trading that would split the church and sour Europe's wine trade for decades. Consider the economics behind these salvation receipts. A single indulgence letter might cost a merchant 50 gold florins steep, but pennies compared to the funeral fees piling up across multiple regions. The real scandal wasn't the price, but the selective enforcement. When Venetian spice merchants could pay to ignore Muslim burial rites while their Genoese rivals couldn't, it tilted entire markets. Records from Avignon show wine shipments dropping by half in 1289, not from poor harvests, but because Provençal traders refused to share ports with indulgence-wielding competitors they called grave cheats. The system's unintended consequences struck hardest in the Rhineland. Here, local bishops had long profited from enforcing strict funeral laws on traveling merchants. When papal indulgences undercut their authority, they retaliated with what we'd now call regulatory sabotage. Cologne's archbishop famously ordered all wine barrels from indulgence using traders to be stamped with scarlet skulls, a not-so-subtle warning that these goods came from spiritually tainted sources. The psychological warfare worked. Cellar masters in Frankfurt began refusing stamped barrels, fearing their contents carried bad luck. Within 2 years, the Rhine wine trade had fractured into warring factions, those who played by local rules versus those who bought papal passes. Perhaps the most bizarre fallout occurred in England. When King Edward I discovered London's wool exporters were using burial indulgences to bypass Flemish funeral taxes, he didn't ban the practice, he monetized it. The Royal Chancery began issuing competing crown indulgences at half the Vatican's price, creating a spiritual bidding war. Documents from the Guildhall show merchants double-dipping, buying both papal and royal permits to hedge their bets. The scheme collapsed when Flemish buyers started rejecting all English wool shipments regardless of paperwork, sparking the trade war that would eventually lead to the Battle of the Golden Spurs. The Church's attempt to clean up the mess only made things worse. In 1345, Pope Clement VI tried standardizing indulgence prices to prevent undercutting. But his fixed rates failed to account for regional disparities. What a Florentine banker considered reasonable was ruinous for a Baltic fur trader. The resulting backlash gave rise to rogue partners selling forged indulgences, some so blatant they misspelled saints' names. A surviving fake from Bruges absolves the bearer from all funeral rites except those of Saint Bartholomew, a saint who, ironically, was skinned alive and wouldn't have had a proper burial himself. This ecclesiastical commerce reached its breaking point with the Great Schism, when rival popes in Avignon and Rome both sold conflicting indulgences. Merchants found themselves caught in theological crossfire. A shipment blessed by one pope might be condemned by the other, leaving traders no choice but to pay both or neither. Parisian wine merchants took the third option. They stopped dealing with church-sanctioned buyers altogether, creating Europe's first secular trade networks. The ledgers of Burgundy's vintners tell the story in dry numbers. By 1400, over 60% of their sales bypassed traditional church-affiliated markets entirely. What began as a clerical fundraising scheme ended up rewriting medieval economics. The burial indulgence trade didn't just challenge religious authority, it proved that no empire, not even the Vatican, could fully control the intersection of death and commerce. When Martin Luther later nailed his protests to that Wittenberg church door, one of his grievances cited these very funeral permits as proof the church had lost its way. In trying to monetize the afterlife, medieval popes accidentally taught merchants a dangerous lesson. Salvation might be priceless, but burial rites, those had a very clear market value. A storm-tossed galley limping into Venice's Grand Canal might as well have flown plague flags if its crew had buried mates at sea without the right words or wreaths. To medieval Venetians, a ship that failed its dead would inevitably fail its contracts because ghosts didn't just haunt hulls, they poisoned profits. Harbor masters kept ledger books of drowned sailors alongside cargo manifests, and woe to the captain who couldn't produce certificates proving every lost crewman had received proper rights. Without those parchment absolutions, your spices could rot on the docks while rival ships unloaded freely. This wasn't just Venetian eccentricity, it was maritime law with divine enforcement. Across the Mediterranean, ports from Barcelona to Acre maintained spiritual quarantine periods, forcing ships with unquiet dead to anchor offshore until priests could perform cleansing rituals. The cost time was money. A Genos carrack delayed 40 days for posthumous blessings might miss the entire Alexandria pepper auction. Captains took desperate measures, like the infamous case of a Ragusan trader who secretly preserved a dead sailor in a cask of honey for 3 months rather than risk burial at sea. When port inspectors discovered the macabre cargo, the scandal led to a total embargo on Ragusan ships, not for public health, but for mocking the journey of souls. The reasoning behind these bans was chillingly practical. Medieval sailors believed improperly buried crewmates would linger as salt ghosts, cursing future voyages. Insurance records from Majorca show underwriters charging triple rates for ships with unresolved dead. while Venetian notaries drafted clauses nullifying contracts if a crewman died without last rites. The consequences weren't merely superstitious, they reshaped trade routes. After 1294, when a Pisan fleet lost 12 men to storms without burial, their home port suffered a 5-year boycott from Sicilian grain traders fearing haunted cargo. Some ports turned spiritual fear into economic weaponry. When Barcelona wanted to undermine Marseille's dominance in the North African leather trade, they spread rumors that Provençal captains were skimping on funeral expenses. The whispers alone caused Tunisian merchants to demand higher prices from Marseille's traders' insurance against ghost tariffs. Meanwhile, the Hanseatic League exploited Baltic fears by requiring all ships entering Lübeck to present not just cargo lists, but soul manifests, accounting for every death aboard since their last port call. Archaeology confirms how deeply these beliefs ran. Excavated shipwrecks from this era reveal makeshift burial artifacts even on modest vessels, tiny lead scrolls with prayers, coins fused to masts where bodies were committed to the deep. A 13th century cog found off Gotland contained a sealed compartment with 9 carefully arranged stones, a sailor's improvised tomb meant to satisfy port inspectors that no spirit would follow the wine casks to shore. The system's collapse came from an unexpected source, the Black Death. As plague ravaged Europe, the sheer volume of dead made traditional burial impossible. Ports that once barred ships over one unshriven sailor now watched hundreds float ashore daily. The old rules shattered out of necessity, replaced by grim pragmatism. Yet even then, merchants found ways to monetize the macabre. Venetian notaries began issuing mass salvation certificates, blanket pardons for all souls lost during a voyage for a fee, of course. Genoa's shipbuilders started constructing vessels with designated mourning decks where last rites could be performed en masse, turning sacred obligation into a shipping industry upsell. What began as spiritual precaution ended as medieval commerce's darkest open secret. Behind every ledger entry about tariffs and tonnage lay an unspoken question: had the dead been paid their due? Because in the medieval maritime world, the quick could only prosper if the departed were properly bribed. The weight of a Viking trader's soul wasn't measured in prayers, it was measured in bronze. When Norse merchants died far from home, their comrades buried them with carefully calibrated scale weights, believing these would serve as tolls for the afterlife's trade routes. To modern eyes, it might seem poetic, but in the bustling amber markets of Hedeby, these grave goods were serious business, so serious that when Arab merchants began recycling excavated Viking weights for their own transactions, it ignited an economic crisis that would freeze Northern Europe's luxury trade for years. At first glance, the dispute seemed simple. Arab traders saw the weights as convenient scrap metal, while Norse elders viewed their reuse as sacrilege. But dig deeper, and you uncover medieval Europe's most bizarre trade war, one fought over trust, measurement, and the ghosts of commerce past. Viking law codes explicitly forbade disturbing grave weights, not just for spiritual reasons, but because they functioned as a posthumous quality guarantee. A merchant buried with his weights signaled he'd traded fairly in life, removed them, and you erased that legacy of honesty. When Arab traders melted down these bronze pieces to stamp with their own markings, Norse customers took it as proof their new partners couldn't be trusted. The conflict came to a head in 1062 when a ruse merchant recognized his dead father's weight in an Arab trader's scale pan near the Volga. The accusation wasn't just theft, it was commercial heresy. Within weeks, Norse trading posts from Novgorod to Dublin imposed embargoes on Arab-handled amber, a luxury more precious than gold in some courts. Byzantine records describe desperate Arab envoys offering triple payment in silver to lift the ban, only to be told no amount of money could cleanse, scale souls stolen from barrow mounds. Archaeology reveals how seriously Vikings guarded these metallic covenants. Excavated graves show weights placed in specific positions, often clasped in the corpse's hands or arranged at the feet like luggage for the next world. Some bore runic inscriptions naming the merchant and his favorite trading partners, transforming simple measures into contractual documents for the afterlife. A weight from a Gotland burial mound even includes a curse promising 9 generations of bad deals to anyone who moved it. The Arabs weren't merely disrespecting the dead, they'd stumbled into a cultural minefield. Viking commerce relied on an unbreakable link between weights, reputation, and eternity. When a Norse trader sealed a deal, he didn't just give his word, he pledged his eternal trading rights. Those bronze weights were his license to operate in the next life's markets. Reusing them wasn't recycling, it was identity theft across centuries. The trade freeze only thawed when an ingenious solution emerged from an unlikely source: Jewish Radhanite merchants. Acting as intermediaries, they proposed a system where Arab traders could commission new weights blessed by Norse shamans, effectively baptizing them into the spiritual economy. These hybrid weights bearing both Arabic numerals and Norse runes became the hottest commodity in 11th century Europe. A single piece weight could fetch its equivalent in silver, not for its measuring precision, but for its power to reopen closed markets. The legacy of this conflict lingers in unexpected places. Modern metrology museums display these excavated weights not just as measurement tools, but as medieval contracts carved in metal. That little T mark on your kitchen scale, it's a distant descendant of the Viking Tyr rune, once stamped on grave weights to invoke the god of justice. Even the concept of dead weight in modern finance traces back to this belief that some obligations outlast death itself. Perhaps the strangest twist came centuries later, when Baltic amber traders adopted a new practice embedding tiny bronze weights in the corners of their shops' foundations. Not for construction, but as spiritual ballast, a silent promise that their measures would remain true in this world and the next. Because in medieval commerce, when the living cheated, it was bad business. But when they cheated the dead, that was an economic apocalypse waiting to happen. The Khazars never imagined their dead could starve the living. Yet when this nomadic empire began abandoning its ancestral burial mounds in the 8th century, their Byzantine trading partners didn't just protest, they accused the Khazars of strangling the very earth. That spring, Constantinople's wheat fields withered inexplicably, olive trees bore shriveled fruit, and when imperial astrologers found no heavenly cause, they pointed north to the overgrown Khazar graves. The logic was merciless: disturb the resting places of warriors who once guarded trade routes, and the land itself would rebel. Within months, Byzantine merchants embargoed Khazar honey, furs, and slaves, not over politics, but because unmaintained graves had become ecological threats in the eyes of a superstitious empire. What sounds like medieval hysteria had roots in startlingly practical concerns. Those burial mounds weren't just spiritual landmarks, they were ancient infrastructure. Khazar kurgan graves were strategically placed atop steppe watersheds, their massive earthworks diverting rainwater to nourish the black soil region's crops. Byzantine agronomists, though they called them earth priests, had observed for generations that farms near maintained mounds yielded better harvests. When the Khazars shifted to new burial customs, leaving old tombs untended, erosion followed. Droughts struck trade-dependent farms along the Dnieper River. To Constantinople, this wasn't coincidence, it was cosmic justice for neglecting the dead who once fed the living. The crisis peaked when Byzantine inspectors arrived to assess the desecration. Their reports read like environmental audits crossed with exorcism manuals. They measured soil salinity near abandoned mounds, noting how cracked earth mirrored the patterns on unwashed burial shrouds. They documented dwindling bee populations around graves stripped of ritual honey offerings, a disaster for orchards reliant on pollination, most damning. They unearthed Khazar burial amulets inscribed with trade agreements, now rusting in the rain. To the Byzantines, this was proof the contracts binding land to merchant had literally corroded. The solution was as ingenious as it was bizarre. Byzantine priests didn't just perform reconsecration rites, they engineered ecological repairs. Teams of monks hauled wagon loads of iron nails to stitch eroded hillsides, mimicking the metal grave goods that once enriched the soil. They replanted native grasses using seeds found in excavated burial pouches, effectively reviving ancient Khazar landscaping. Most strikingly, they commissioned new, trade guardian statues to stand watch over restored mounds, not carved in Byzantine style, but forged by Khazar smiths paid in Byzantine gold. This wasn't archaeology, it was economic stimulus disguised as necromancy. The results stunned even skeptics. Within 2 years, harvests rebounded so dramatically that Bulgarian middlemen accused both empires of hoarding grain. But the real lesson was in the ledgers. Byzantine customs records show Khazar goods flowing again with a new line item, tribute to mound wardens. These weren't taxes, but payments to a rotating guard of Khazar and Byzantine sentries who maintained graves as shared infrastructure. A single ledger from Cherson mentions wages for grave gardeners who cultivated medicinal herbs atop tombs, their roots binding soil while their leaves supplied apothecaries. Death had become a joint venture. Modern soil science confirms the wisdom beneath the superstition. Khazar burial mounds created nutrient sinks, their layered construction acting like slow-release fertilizer capsules. The iron weapons and tools interred with warriors oxidized over centuries, enriching the steppes' famously fertile black earth. When abandonment halted this process, it wasn't ghosts that punished the living, it was chemistry. Yet the Byzantines weren't entirely wrong to connect ritual to harvest. Their reconsecration rites involved burying amphorae of wine at mound edges, a practice now known to encourage beneficial microbial growth. Even the trade guardian statues served a purpose. Their hollow bases housed beehives, restoring pollination routes disrupted by grave neglect. The Khazar-Byzantine pact that emerged from this crisis rewrote medieval trade rules. For the next 300 years, treaties between empires included mound clauses requiring joint maintenance of ancestral graves. A fragment from a 10th century agreement unearthed in Kerch stipulates that for every 10 Byzantine ships allowed in Khazar ports, one must carry mound stone and honey for the old ones. It was the world's first environmental tariff paid not to the living, but to the dead who kept the land alive. When archaeologists today uncover these joint Byzantine-Khazar graves, they find something remarkable. Layers of trade goods arranged chronologically, like a mercantile time capsule. Bottom layers hold Khazar arrowheads and Byzantine coins. Higher up, Venetian glass appears alongside Islamic dinars. The message is clear: commerce flourished when graves were tended. Because in the medieval world, the quick could only eat if the dead were properly fed. A royal tomb wasn't just a resting place, it was the medieval equivalent of a notary's office with teeth. When King Louis VII of France needed to cement his truce with Henry II of England in 1158, he didn't summon diplomats to a sunlit palace. Instead, he led the English king through the dripping catacombs beneath St. Denis Abbey, stopping before the sarcophagus of Charles the Bald. There, with skeletal witnesses watching, Both monarchs swore their pact would last as long as these bones keep their rest. The message was clear: violate these terms and you'd answer not just to living enemies but to 9 centuries of French kings. This practice turned graveyards into geopolitical chessboards. Byzantine emperors conducted treaty signings inside the Church of the Holy Apostles, their hands resting on reliquaries containing the bones of saints and previous rulers. A single lie spoken over these sacred remains was believed to summon supernatural consequences: crops failing, ships sinking, plagues striking. Merchants loved these arrangements because they came with built-in enforcement. No ruler wanted to explain to his people why their ancestors' graves were suddenly cursed because he cheated on a wool tariff. The genius lay in the paperwork. Unlike flimsy parchment treaties that could burn or fade, tombstone clauses were literally carved in stone. When the Holy Roman Empire and Poland settled a bitter trade dispute in 1241, they didn't file documents in some forgotten chancery. They commissioned matching bronze plaques bolted to the graves of both nations' founding kings. Want to renegotiate the deal? First, you'd need to pry metal from dead hands while explaining yourself to an angry mob of pilgrims. Some rulers took this further by burying treaty copies with their predecessors. Excavations at Winchester Cathedral revealed a startling find. The coffin of William the Conqueror contained not just his bones, but a lead scroll listing every trade agreement he'd signed. This wasn't sentimental hoarding, it was strategic. Any successor breaking those pacts would be desecrating the conqueror's tomb by default. The ultimate medieval power move. Hungarian kings kept their most sacred contracts inside St. Stephen's silver coffin itself, requiring 12 bishops and the crown prince to witness any amendments by candlelight at midnight. The system had spectacular unintended consequences. When Alfonso VI of Leon needed leverage against his rebellious nobles in 1085, he didn't raise taxes or call up troops. He simply moved his court into the royal crypt for 3 months, conducting all state business surrounded by his forebears' bones. The psychological pressure worked. Nobles who'd happily defy a living king balked at arguing over grain taxes while standing on their great-grandfather's grave. But the real masterstroke came from the Venetians, who turned ancestral wrath into maritime law. Their doges required foreign ambassadors to swear trade oaths while touching the relics of St. Mark in the Basilica, with one catch. The relics rested atop a hidden compartment containing the bones of previous doges. Break your word, and you weren't just lying to a saint, you were betraying 8 centuries of Venetian rulers simultaneously. Ship captains reported Genoese merchants crossing themselves before signing anything in Venice, terrified of supernatural reprisals. This fear wasn't entirely irrational. Medieval chronicles overflow with proof of ancestral vengeance. When the Duke of Burgundy violated a cemetery-sworn truce with Flanders in 1312, an unseasonable frost destroyed his vineyards within weeks. Coincidence? Not according to Flemish traders, who made sure every new business partner heard how the Duke died screaming of phantom pains on the exact anniversary of his betrayal. The practice only faded when Renaissance bankers introduced something scarier than ghostly wrath: compound interest. But for centuries, the threat of angry ancestors kept medieval commerce more honest than any court could enforce. Because while kings might forgive a broken promise, the dead never forgot, and they had eternity to collect. In the bustling ports of medieval Gujarat, the price of pepper wasn't set in market squares, it was decided beside funeral pyres. Hindu merchants believed a soul could only reach the afterlife if the body burned with specific sacred woods: sandalwood for purity, mango for prosperity, and banyan for longevity. But when the Delhi Sultanate seized control in the 1300s, they saw these funeral rites not as sacred traditions, but as untapped revenue. Overnight, Muslim tax collectors imposed staggering levies on cremation wood, turning grief into a taxable commodity. The consequences rippled far beyond graveyards. Suddenly, the cost of dying dictated the cost of doing business, and the spice trade would never be the same. At first, the Sultanate's logic seemed sound. Gujarat's Hindu merchants controlled the flow of Malabar pepper to the Mediterranean. Why not tax a necessity they couldn't refuse? But they underestimated how deeply commerce and cremation were intertwined. For Hindu traders, funeral costs weren't just expenses, they were investments in cosmic credit. A poorly funded pyre might doom a family's fortunes for generations, so merchants stockpiled premium woods like currency. When taxes tripled the price of sandalwood, they didn't cut back, they passed the cost to their foreign buyers. A Venetian ledger from 1342 shows the shocking result. Pepper prices spiked by 70% in a single season, with a marginal note blaming the fire tax of infidels. The Venetians initially assumed this was a temporary squeeze. Then they learned the Sultanate had weaponized the wood shortage. By restricting shipments of mango timber to Hindu funeral guilds, they created artificial scarcity. Soon, Gujarati merchants demanded not just gold for their pepper, but literal boatloads of European oak for their pyres. A surviving contract from Genoa reveals a desperate workaround. Italian merchants agreeing to deliver 20 cords of Lombard chestnut per spice shipment, with penalties if the wood burned too fast. Cargo manifests became bizarre hybrids, half trade goods, half funeral supplies. One Ragusan ship sank off Crete carrying black pepper and a hold full of olive logs stamped for sacred flames only. The crisis reached its peak when Venetian traders tried circumventing the system. In 1351, a consortium of merchants bribed Sultanate officials to exempt Hindu partners from the wood tax. The backlash was instant. Hindu priests condemned the tainted spices from these deals, claiming they carried the stench of burnt bribes. Orthodox buyers in Cairo and Constantinople refused the discounted pepper, fearing it would curse their own goods. Within months, the Venetians had to dump entire shipments at a loss and return to paying the original wood tariffs. The lesson was brutal. In Gujarat, even death had a monopoly. Archaeology confirms how deeply this system ran. Excavated merchant ledgers from Cambay list funeral wood expenditures alongside spice inventories, with columns calculating how much pepper needed to be sold to cover each cremation. A particularly poignant tablet from 1378 shows a trader's desperate math. His father's pyre required 600 pounds of pepper profits, plunging the family into debt. Meanwhile, shipwrecks off the Gujarat coast reveal an unexpected cargo. Bundles of European timber carefully lashed to protect them from seawater, destined not for ship repairs but for funeral fires. The Sultanate's successors eventually abandoned the tax, but its legacy endured. For centuries afterward, Hindu merchants factored wood security into trade deals, sometimes demanding advance payments in timber rather than coin. A Portuguese account from 1520 describes a Gujarati trader refusing a chest of Spanish silver, insisting instead on wood that burns slow and sweet. Because in the end, medieval commerce wasn't just about moving goods, it was about ensuring those who traded them could rest in peace, and sometimes that required setting the right price for the flames that would carry them home. The deep tolling of funeral bells wasn't just a mournful sound, it was the heartbeat of medieval commerce. In towns like Bruges, where trade depended on trust and tradition, skipping a single death knell could unravel entire economies. When the city failed to ring its bells for the passing of Duke Philip the Good in 1467, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Flemish wool merchants, interpreting the silence as disrespect, refused to unload their ships. English buyers, fearing some unspoken scandal, cancelled orders en masse. Within weeks, Bruges' bustling markets fell eerily quiet, its warehouses overflowing with unsold cloth. The boycott lasted a full year, proving that in the medieval world, sound wasn't just ceremony, it was currency. This wasn't superstition, it was sonic accounting. Funeral bells served as auditory ledgers, their peals counting out the social value of the deceased. A duke merited 300 tolls, a bishop 200, a wealthy merchant 50, each ring a public receipt for services rendered. When Italian bankers in Lyon heard the bells of St. Jean chime, an uneven sequence in 1421, they didn't mourn, they checked their books. The irregular pattern signaled the death of a tax collector who owed them thousands, allowing them to freeze his estate's assets before his family could hide them. Some cities turned bell rituals into competitive advantages. Cologne's guilds paid extra to have their members' funerals announced with distinctive triple strokes, a branding exercise that made their goods more desirable. Buyers trusted wool stamped with a weaver's name whose passing had been properly counted. Conversely, when Ghent's bell ringers went on strike in 1389, Hanseatic traders rejected all local linen, fearing the silent looms might be cutting corners too. The most ingenious system developed in Venice, where funeral bells doubled as trade signals. The deep campanile tone marking a doge's death also triggered a 40-day moratorium on debt collection, a fact shrewd merchants exploited. Ships would race to port upon hearing the news, knowing creditors couldn't seize their goods. Meanwhile, the glassmakers of Murano timed their furnace restarts to the bells of San Michel's cemetery, believing only blessed sound could purify their furnaces after a death. Miss the toll, and your next batch of Cristallo glass might shatter from unclean air. Archaeologists have found evidence of this acoustic economy in unlikely places. Excavated merchant seals from Norwich bear tiny bell motifs, while recovered ship logs from the Baltic show captains noting bell patterns as dutifully as weather reports. A Lübeck trader's journal from 1415 meticulously records the bell sequences heard in 14 ports, cross-referenced with that year's profits as if decoding some sonic stock market. The system collapsed when Reformation iconoclasm melted down church bells across Northern Europe, but the instinct survived in subtler forms. Dutch auction houses adopted the practice of ringing a small bell before closing bids, while London's Royal Exchange installed its own trade passing bell in 1622. Even today, the New York Stock Exchange's opening bell carries echoes of those medieval chimes, reminders that commerce has always moved to the rhythm of remembrance. Because in the end, whether in Bruges or on Wall Street, markets don't just run on numbers, they run on trust, and sometimes trust needs to ring out loud enough for everyone to hear. A Hanseatic harbour master inspecting a cog's cargo might ignore smuggled silks but recoil at a single unwashed shroud. To the League's merchants, a corpse without proper rites wasn't just a tragedy, it was contraband more dangerous than gunpowder. Their strict "no ghosts aboard" policy forced ships to detour for emergency burials, sometimes adding weeks to voyages. But where cautious captains saw risk, cunning entrepreneurs spotted opportunity. Soon, the North Sea buzzed with vessels carrying suspiciously fresh corpses, conveniently reviving once rival ships had been scared away from lucrative routes. The scam was diabolically simple. A ship approaching a crowded Baltic port might suddenly raise a black flag, signaling a death on board. According to Hanseatic law, all other vessels had to clear the harbor until priests confirmed the body's proper burial. Clever captains exploited this by staging deaths with paid actors wrapped in linens, then enjoying days of uncontested loading while competitors idled offshore. Records from Lübeck's Admiralty Court describe one audacious case where a single, dead sailor miraculously perished and resurrected 7 times between Danzig and Amsterdam, each death securing his ship exclusive access to Prussian grain. Piracy took an even darker turn when merchants realized funeral documents could be forged as easily as corpses. The Hanseatic Certificate of Clean Passage, proof all deaths had been properly handled, became medieval currency. A bundle of blank certificates stolen from a Rostock church in 1423 flooded black markets from Bergen to Bruges. Suddenly, ships carrying actual plague victims could buy pristine paperwork, while healthy crews found themselves barred for lacking proper documentation. The resulting chaos saw entire herring fleets stranded by inspectors who couldn't distinguish real outbreaks from fabricated ones. Some ports fought back with macabre verification systems. Copenhagen's harbour masters required deceased sailors to be presented with coins on their eyelids, a practice meant to prove the body hadn't been reused. Bergen went further, nailing temporary graves shot with trade permits that would break if tampered with. But the most ingenious countermeasure came from Tallinn, where officials mixed funeral rites with cryptography. Each buried sailor received a lead token stamped with that voyage secret harbor password. Dig up the token, and you'd know if the burial was genuine. The system's collapse came from an unexpected source, an overzealous regulation. As Hanseatic paperwork grew more elaborate, the cost of proper burials skyrocketed. A 1451 ledger from Hamburg shows shipowners spending more on funeral permits than crew wages. Desperate captains began tossing bodies overboard secretly, creating the very spectral hazards the laws were meant to prevent. When a storm washed hundreds of improperly buried sailors ashore in 1489, their identification tags revealed a shocking truth: most weren't sailors at all, but paupers purchased from prisons to serve as professional dead. The legacy of this morbid commerce lingers in modern maritime law. That burial at sea clause in shipping contracts, it's a direct descendant of Hanseatic ghost ship panic. Even the tradition of ringing bells when passing cemeteries at sea stems from this era, originally meant to drown out the whispers of those who'd been buried by ledger rather than liturgy. Because in medieval trade, the quickest way to kill competition wasn't with swords or sabotage, it was with a well-timed death certificate and a convincing moan from under a tarpaulin. A Saxon widow standing by a roadside grave mound with an outstretched hand wasn't begging for alms, she was collecting what the law called wheel silver. Every cart that rattled too close to her husband's burial mound owed a fee, not for damaging the earth, but for disturbing the peace of the dead. And in 10th century Saxony, that silver didn't just line pockets, it built armies. These road tolls, extracted from careless traders, became the unexpected engine funding a brutal war against Denmark, turning grief into geopolitical leverage with every coin dropped into a widow's palm. The system was brutally efficient. Grave mounds lining trade routes doubled as border markers and tax stations. A merchant transporting Frankish wine to Baltic ports might face a dozen such stops, each widow citing ancient laws that placed a price on silence. The closer the wheels came to the mound's edge, the higher the toll, a sliding scale of sacrilege measured in inches. Records from Hamburg's merchant guilds complain of journeys where burial fees exceeded actual road taxes, with one particularly unlucky trader paying 8 separate widow tolls in a single day's travel. But here's where it became strategic. Saxon warlords didn't just let widows keep these coins. They formalized the system, issuing grave licenses that required traders to prepay tolls at regional strongholds. The widow at the mound became a tax collector in black wool, her very presence a reminder that commerce here moved at the pleasure of the dead. And when war with Denmark loomed in 982, these accumulated fees, officially labeled restitution to the wronged, were melted down to mint swords and chainmail. The Danes quickly recognized the economic warfare at play when their spies reported that Saxon border forts were being rebuilt with ghost silver. They retaliated not with raids but with counterfeit burials. Danish crews would erect fake grave mounds overnight along contested trade routes, stationing their own widows to divert Saxon-bound revenue. A recovered runestone near Hedeby brags of one such operation that siphoned enough silver to bribe an entire Saxon garrison, a victory won not with axes but with strategic gravedigging. Archaeology reveals how deeply this practice ran. Excavated Saxon burial sites along old trade roads show deliberate positioning mounds built just close enough to force carts into single file, maximizing toll opportunities. Some even feature stone measuring arms protruding into the road, ensuring no trader could claim they'd passed at a respectful distance. Meanwhile, Danish burial sites from the same period cluster unnaturally near fords and mountain passes, their placement clearly tactical rather than sacred. The system's genius lay in its unassailable moral logic. Challenging the tolls meant disrespecting the dead, a stance no merchant could afford when his next shipment might depend on local goodwill. Even Christian missionaries who normally condemned pagan burial practices turned a blind eye to the widow tolls. After all, the silver was funding their protection. A bishop's letter from 995 admits grudgingly that the tears of widows build better walls than prayers alone. When the Saxon-Danish wars finally ended in 1018, the tolls didn't disappear, they evolved. Widows became officially recognized tollkeepers, their rights to grave fees enshrined in peace treaties. A Danish census from 1042 lists over 200 mound wardens, drawing steady incomes from roads their ancestors had weaponized. The practice only faded when Norman invaders, baffled by this economy of grief, replaced burial tolls with standardized taxes. But for nearly 2 centuries, the quiet clink of coins into widows' hands had been the sound of empires arming themselves one disturbed ghost at a time. The harbor of Pisa bristled with uneasy whispers in the spring of 1184. 3 Genoese galleys had sunk in quick succession, not to storms or pirates, but to what sailors called the Saint's Hand. Each vessel had carried stolen relics from a Pisan church, and now they rested on the seafloor alongside their sacred cargo. To Genoa's merchants, these wrecks were tragic accidents. But Pisa's rulers saw divine justice at work, and they wielded it like a commercial weapon. Overnight, they declared any ship that had touched Genoese relics spiritually contaminated, banning them from Pisan ports until purified by weeks of costly rituals. What began as a holy heist had escalated into history's first supernatural trade embargo. The relics in question weren't just objects, they were economic linchpins. Saint Ephraim's bones had drawn pilgrims to Pisa for decades, their veneration filling city coffers with silver. When Genoese raiders snatched them during a coastal raid, they didn't just steal bones, they hijacked an entire tourism economy. But Pisa's retaliation revealed a deeper truth. In medieval commerce, faith wasn't just belief, it was infrastructure. Their quarantine wasn't merely punishment, it was quality control. By declaring Genoese-associated ships unclean, they forced Mediterranean traders to choose sides. Venetian captains who'd happily docked in both cities now faced impossible calculations: risk losing Pisa's lucrative alum trade by visiting Genoa, or forfeit Genoa's eastern connections to keep Pisa's blessings. Genoa's attempts to circumvent the ban veered into dark comedy. One captain tried smuggling goods via Corsica, only for his ship to run aground on the exact feast day of Saint Ephrem. Pisan priests declared this proof of divine intervention, while Geno's merchants muttered about sabotage charts. Other traders hired Jewish middlemen to handle cursed cargo, believing different faiths might bypass the saint's wrath. This backfired spectacularly when Pisa extended the quarantine to any vessel that had employed Jewish brokers, citing possible spiritual contamination through association. The most ingenious and ruthless twist came when Pisa weaponized insurance. Maritime lenders traditionally refused coverage for acts of God, but Pisan notaries began interpreting this clause creatively. Any ship lost after contacting Geno's relics was retroactively deemed divinely stricken, voiding claims. Soon, insurers demanded sworn affidavits proving a vessel's relic-free history, creating medieval compliance paperwork. A surviving contract from Marseille shows a shipowner listing every port his vessel had visited for the past decade, with priests from each locale attesting under oath that no Geno's relics had come aboard. Archaeology confirms how seriously Mediterranean traders took this curse. Excavated shipwrecks from this period show crews carrying anti-relic talismans lead scrolls inscribed with prayers to neutralize stolen saints' influence. One galley found off Sardinia had its entire forecastle converted into a makeshift chapel, complete with a mosaic floor depicting Saint Ephrem's face crossed out in red tile. Even Genoa's own records betray creeping doubt. Their admiralty logs start noting unexplained cargo shifts and mast breaks only on relic-bearing ships, while captains' journals describe tossing suspicious bones overboard after minor mishaps. The standoff finally ended through grim pragmatism. After 12 years of dwindling trade, both cities allowed a face-saving compromise. Genoa would return different relics conveniently acquired from Anatolia, while claiming they'd recovered Saint Ephrem all along. Pisa's priests performed an elaborate purification ceremony for a fee, and Mediterranean commerce resumed, but the precedent stuck. For centuries afterward, treaties between Italian city-states included relic clauses requiring mutual notification of sacred acquisitions, less out of piety than economic prudence. Because in medieval Europe, the quickest way to sink a rival's economy wasn't with cannons or blockades, it was by convincing the market their goods came with a side of celestial wrath. Burned books weren't just ashes, they were economic landmines waiting to detonate. In the tight-knit world of medieval Jewish merchants, sacred texts held more than spiritual value. They were binding contracts with the divine, and when mishandled, they could unravel entire trade networks overnight. Take the disaster in Mainz in 1142, when a waterlogged Torah scroll was mistakenly buried with a respected trader without the required purification rites. To the local Jewish community, this wasn't just negligence, it was a breach of cosmic accounting. The scroll's defilement meant its teachings could no longer guide business dealings, leaving transactions spiritually unsecured. Within days, Rhineland merchants refused to honor debts or ship goods, fearing divine retribution for trading on voided holy authority. The ripple effects were staggering. Mainz's bustling market, where Jewish traders had brokered deals between Frankish wool merchants and Italian spice importers, fell silent. Ledgers from Cologne show cancelled orders for Spanish saffron and Bohemian glass, all over a single buried scroll. But the real crisis came when neighboring communities learned of the desecration. Jewish trade councils from Worms to Speyer declared Mainz's goods spiritually compromised, enacting what amounted to a medieval embargo. A merchant's reputation hinged on the sanctity of their texts. No one would risk partnering with those who let holy words rot in the ground. This was no isolated incident. Across Europe, Jewish merchants developed intricate rituals to prevent such catastrophes. Sacred texts too damaged for use weren't simply discarded. They were entombed in sacred genizot, special repositories often built beneath synagogues. These weren't just respectful storage spaces, they functioned as spiritual escrow accounts. A Talmud buried properly in Cairo's Ben Ezra synagogue could still witness trade agreements, its authority intact even in decay. But a Torah stuffed haphazardly into a Mainz grave, that was like tearing up a notary's seal mid-contract. The Mainz crisis only ended after months of painstaking reparations. The scroll was exhumed, cleansed with ritual precision, and reburied in a proper geniza. Every merchant who'd traded with the deceased had to renew their vows over the corrected grave. Even then, trust returned slowly. A letter from a Regensburg spice trader reveals lingering unease. "I will take their silver again, but only after 3 new moons prove no ill fortune follows." Christian rulers, baffled by this textual economy, still recognized its power. When Holy Roman emperors granted Jewish communities burial rights, they often specified clauses about scripture handling not out of piety, but because they knew desecration could freeze tax revenues. In 1281, Rudolf of Habsburg even stationed imperial guards at a Vienna geniza, after rumors spread that looted Torah fragments had destabilized the Danube wine trade. The deeper lesson: in medieval commerce, knowledge wasn't just power, it was currency with celestial backing. A Venetian trader might swear on the Bible, but a Jewish merchant's oath over a buried Talmud carried weight from 2 worlds. Break that bond and you didn't just lose trust, you risked divine chargebacks on every deal you'd ever made. Dead men's clothes should have been the one thing no medieval tax collector would touch. But in the wool trade between England and Flanders, even shrouds became battlegrounds. The English crown had long exempted funeral linen from export tariffs, considering it sacred necessity rather than taxable commodity. That changed when Flemish weavers noticed a loophole. Undyed burial cloth looked identical to raw wool fabric. Suddenly, ships leaving London's docks were stacked with suspiciously large consignments of shrouds, a far more than any plague season could explain. Flanders textile guilds had turned mourning into a smuggling operation, bleaching and dyeing the supposedly sacred fabric into luxury cloth that undercut English producers. The English response was as swift as it was macabre. In 1321, royal inspectors began demanding proof that exported shrouds had actually been used for burials. Merchants now had to present not just customs paperwork, but signed affidavits from priests attesting to funerals witnessed. One surviving document from York details a hapless trader trying to explain why his shroud shipment bore vivid Flemish scarlet dye, claiming it was for a very festive funeral. The scheme collapsed when English officials started requiring corpses to be wrapped in situ at ports, with harbour masters stamping the cloth with lead seals that would disintegrate if removed. Flanders retaliated with psychological warfare. Their spinners began producing deliberately coarse, scratchy burial cloth technically compliant with English law, but so unbearable against skin that mourners refused to use it. Ghent's weavers even wielded funerary patterns into the fabric, skeletal motifs and ominous Latin verses that made the cloth unsellable as regular textile. English wool exports plummeted as buyers balked at receiving shipments that looked like they'd been looted from catacombs. The conflict reached its absurd peak when Bruges dyers developed a vanishing ink for their fraudulent shrouds. The fabric would pass inspection as plain white linen at English docks, only to reveal rich azure and crimson hues after a few days at sea, a trick achieved by treating the cloth with concealed chemical washes. London's customs officers responded by storing suspect shipments in vinegar-soaked warehouses, where the acids neutralized the hidden dyes. For 3 years, the two sides engaged in this eerie arms race of alchemy and mortuary theatrics, turning quaysides into open-air chemistry labs. Archaeologists have found traces of this textile Cold War in unlikely places. Excavated Flemish graves from the period show corpses wrapped in fabric with faint English customs stamps, still visible proof that some genuine shrouds were smuggled back home for reuse. Meanwhile, English port records list increasingly bizarre confiscations. A shipment of mourning veils that unspooled into enough silk for 50 gowns, a casket of holy burial ribbons that were really Bolognese embroidery thread. The standoff only ended when the Black Death made the loophole irrelevant. As plague ravaged Europe, demand for legitimate shrouds outstripped smuggling profits. But the legacy of these macabre tariffs lived on in unexpected ways. Modern funeral industry regulations, like requirements for biodegradable burial materials, trace their roots to those medieval disputes over what constituted real mourning cloth. And the next time you see a customs form with oddly specific exemptions, remember, somewhere in bureaucratic history, there's probably a corpse wrapped in a loophole. Lisbon's merchants didn't just think outside the box, they buried their ledgers in it. By the 1400s, Portugal's capital had perfected a devious workaround for crippling trade taxes, the sacred storage unit. Goods from spices to silks weren't just stockpiled in warehouses, they were tucked into catacombs beneath churches, labeled as funerary offerings for the dead. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. Tax inspectors couldn't touch items destined for the afterlife, so merchants simply declared every bale of pepper, every bolt of Flemish cloth, a pious gift for departed souls. For years, Lisbon's customs officers paced helplessly above a subterranean economy where the dead held more inventory than the living. The system worked flawlessly until someone pried open the wrong tomb. In 1483, a suspicious royal agent ordered an inspection of the crypts beneath São Domingo's church. What he found wasn't skeletal remains surrounded by modest tokens, but a bustling commercial hub. Silk from Granada spilled out of sarcophagi meant for bishops. Saffron from Persia filled hollowed-out altars. Most damning of all, ledgers hidden inside coffins detailed precise donation dates, time to market fluctuations, proving these were no spontaneous acts of devotion. The scandal didn't just expose greed, it revealed how thoroughly commerce had colonized the sacred. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Furious clergy declared the entire stock spiritually contaminated, refusing to bless any goods that had shared space with the dead. Portuguese buyers, fearing divine retribution, rejected shipments that might have passed through the catacombs. Venetian traders, always quick to exploit weakness, spread rumors that Lisbon's spices carried grave mold, crashing prices overnight. But the real damage was to trust itself. For generations, Iberian trade had relied on the honor system surrounding funeral rites. Now that system lay in ruins, taking Portugal's creditworthiness with it. Archaeologists still find traces of this sacrilegious supply chain. Excavated crypts in Lisbon reveal modified tombs with false bottoms and hidden compartments, some large enough to hold barrels of wine. A particularly brazen example uncovered in 1992 had a pulley system installed in a saint's sepulchre, allowing merchants to lower goods directly from the church floor above. Meanwhile, recovered customs logs from the period show baffling entries like 20 casks of olive oil for eternal repose, next to mundane items like nails and rope. The church's response reshaped global trade. Within a year of the scandal, the Pope issued a bull requiring all funeral offerings to fit in a single wooden box no larger than a loaf of bread, a rule that inadvertently standardized medieval container shipping. Portuguese merchants, now barred from their crypt warehouses, turned their sights westward across the Atlantic, seeking new frontiers where taxes couldn't follow. Some historians argue the Catacombs scandal didn't just expose fraud, it accelerated the age of exploration by forcing traders to look beyond Europe's graveyards for opportunity. Yet the most enduring legacy might be linguistic. The Portuguese phrase "negocio sujo," literally dirty business, originally referred not to corruption, but to goods literally tainted by tomb dust. And that loaf-sized limit on funeral offerings, it survives today in customs declarations for personal effects, a quiet echo of the moment when Lisbon learned the hard way that some loopholes belong 6 feet under. In Bruges' bustling foreign quarter, even death had a price tag, and the highest bidder didn't just win a funeral plot, they won a merchant dynasty's future. Every year, the city's powerful guilds held silent auctions for burial rites in the coveted Nation and Friedhof, where foreign traders could rest among their own. But this wasn't about securing eternal peace, it was about controlling living fortunes. The winning bidder didn't just bury their dead, they secured exclusive trading privileges for their entire community. Lose the auction and your compatriots faced more than grief. They faced economic exile from the Flemish wool trade that fueled Europe's luxury markets. The rules were brutally simple. Each merchant group, Spanish, Genos, Hanseatic, nominated a representative to bid in a closed-room auction where bids were scratched onto wax tablets. No speeches, no counters, just cold numbers that determined whose dead would sanctify their living commerce. A surviving ledger from 1429 shows the Hanseatic League paying the equivalent of 6 years' warehouse rents for a single burial plot. Not because they needed the space, but because losing would have barred their merchants from Bruges' annual wool allotment. The real prize wasn't underground, it was in the guild hall where auction results dictated next season's trade quotas. Some communities turned these morbid auctions into high-stakes poker. Venetian traders famously pooled funds to create burial consortia, spreading the risk across dozens of families. Their ledgers show meticulous calculations. If 4 elderly members were expected to die in a given year, they'd budget bids accordingly. But when the plague hit in 1348, their actuarial bets collapsed. With 37 Venetians perishing in months, the consortia couldn't afford enough plots, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction. Surviving records from Bruges' archives show Venetian wool imports dropping to zero that season, not from lack of demand, but because without burial rites, their living merchants were legally barred from trading. The system's cruelest twist, how it punished the bereaved twice over. Families who lost auctions weren't just denied local burial, they had to remove their dead from Bruges entirely within 3 days. A logistical nightmare in an era without refrigeration. Hanseatic merchants developed grim expertise in quick transports, hermetically sealing corpses in barrels of salt or honey for the journey home. A particularly desperate case from 1361 describes a Genos widow who disguised her husband's body as a shipment of salted cod, only for the ruse to be discovered when the fish started wearing his signet ring. The scandal led to a 5-year ban on Genos burial bids, and by extension, their access to Flemish wool. Archaeology reveals the psychological toll of these auctions. Excavated graves in the Nation and Friedhof show bizarre disparities, elaborate marble monuments crammed beside unmarked pits, reflecting which communities had won or lost bidding wars that year. Meanwhile, Bruges' port district has yielded lead tokens stamped with numbers, likely used as clandestine counters during secret pre-auction strategy sessions. The most poignant find, a Hanseatic merchant's diary describing how his guild stored emergency burial funds in a chest with 3 locks, its keys held by separate elders to prevent impulsive bids. The practice only collapsed when Burgundian dukes recognized its economic toxicity. By the mid-1500s, new laws guaranteed all foreign merchants basic burial rights, but the legacy of those cutthroat auctions lived on in modern commerce. That silent auction at your local charity gala, its origins trace back to Bruges' graveside bidding wars, where silence wasn't just golden, it was the difference between mercantile survival and oblivion. Because in medieval trade, the quick could only prosper if the dead were strategically placed. Coin-stuffed corpses turned graveyards into the ultimate medieval tax shelters. Picture a Venetian merchant sweating under his mourning cloak, not from grief, but from the weight of silver ducats sewn into his deceased uncle's shroud. This macabre smuggling tactic exploited a universal taboo: who would disturb the dead for mere customs inspections. For decades, coffins carried more contraband than cargo holds, with funeral processions doubling as underground supply chains. The scheme was flawless until regulators decided the living weren't the only ones who had to pay their dues. The practice began innocently enough. Pilgrims returning from the Holy Land would slip a few coins into loved ones' graves as spiritual offerings. But sharp-eyed traders noticed something miraculous: those coins never seemed to stay buried. Local gravediggers, taking their cut, would quietly retrieve the money and funnel it back into circulation. By the 1300s, what began as pious gifts had evolved into sophisticated laundering operations. A Genos ledger from 1342 details how one shipmaster donated 300 gold florins to his father's tomb in Alexandria, only for the exact sum to reappear weeks later in a Cairo spice market. Authorities initially turned a blind eye until the scale became impossible to ignore. When customs agents in Barcelona dug up a beggar's pauper grave in 1371, they didn't find bones. They discovered enough Castilian silver to mint a small army's worth of coins. The corpse itself was a clever fake, a straw-stuffed dummy wrapped in perfumed linens to mask the scent. This wasn't isolated. Similar stashes surfaced from Bruges to Byzantium. In Venice, investigators uncovered a funeral guild operating as a full-service smuggling network, complete with counterfeit death certificates and rented mourners to throw off inspectors. The crackdown came swift and brutal. Mediterranean port cities instituted mandatory grave inspections, requiring witnesses to verify burials, but the cure proved worse than the disease. Muslim merchants, whose faith demanded rapid interment without physical contact with the dead, found themselves unable to comply. Jewish traders faced agonizing choices between halakhic law and customs regulations. Even Christian commerce suffered when the new rules delayed burials for days in summer heat, creating public health disasters. A Florentine chronicler describes the Great Stink of 1389, when backlogged corpses at Pisa's docks spoiled an entire season's silk shipments. Some smugglers adapted with grotesque ingenuity. Cadavers became living, or rather, recently living ledgers. Traders would swallow gemstones or gold pellets before dying of sudden illnesses, trusting accomplices to retrieve the goods post-burial. Autopsy records from Marseille describe a plague victim whose stomach contained enough raw amber to buy a country estate. Others turned to animal proxies. A scandal erupted in Valencia when inspectors found 52 hollowed-out hunting dogs buried with Moroccan gold in their bellies. The most unexpected fallout: how the crisis birthed modern banking. With corpse smuggling routes closed, merchants needed new ways to move wealth discreetly. Enter the bill of exchange, a paper promise that could cross borders without tempting gravediggers. The Medici family's rise traces directly to this shift. Their early ledgers show surging demand for clean transfers after 1400. Even the concept of life insurance emerged from these morbid logistics, as traders sought guarantees their wealth wouldn't literally be buried with them. Archaeologists still uncover echoes of this macabre trade. Excavated cemeteries near medieval ports show abnormal numbers of reopened graves, their edges tooled with pry marks rather than reverent hands. Coins found in these tombs often bear tiny notches, smugglers accounting marks disguised as damage. Meanwhile, recovered customs manuals detail increasingly bizarre inspection techniques, from sniffing shrouds for metal polish to tapping coffins for the telltale clink of hidden bullion. The system's collapse left an indelible mark on commerce. That declaration of valuables form you fill out at modern airports. Its lineage stretches back to Venetian grave inspectors tallying ducats in cadaverous cheeks. And the next time you see a hearse pass by, consider this: 7 centuries ago, that solemn procession might have been the most profitable delivery route in town. Parisian gravediggers didn't just bury bodies, they buried empires. In 1382, the coffin makers of Paris staged history's most macabre labor strike, weaponizing the dead against the living. Their demand: lower taxes on imported spices used in embalming. Their method: a citywide burial freeze that left corpses stacked in homes and churches, rotting beneath summer sun while the spice guilds panicked. This wasn't protest, it was medieval economic warfare waged with unburied ancestors as the shock troops. The conflict began with something as mundane as nutmeg. Embalmers relied on imported spices to preserve elite corpses, but King Charles VI's new tariffs had tripled their costs. When negotiations failed, the Confrérie des Ensevelisseurs, the Brotherhood of Shrouders, made their move. They declared no member would prepare a body until the taxes were repealed, knowing full well the domino effect this would trigger. Without burials, no death certificates could be issued. Without certificates, inheritances froze, and frozen inheritances meant the wealthy couldn't liquidate estates to pay for luxuries. Like spices, within weeks the strike's genius became apparent. The spice merchants' warehouses overflowed with unsold cinnamon and cloves, their value plummeting as demand evaporated. But the real pressure point was the church. Canon law required burial within 3 days, yet here were bishops watching parishioners' corpses bloat in makeshift crypts. A leaked letter from the Archbishop of Paris reveals desperate pleas to the crown. The stench of delayed salvation threatens riot in the streets, and still the shrouders stand unmoved. The strikers exploited every psychological advantage. They organized rot tours, leading grieving families past spice shops while chanting how much cheaper preservation would be without the king's greed. When merchants tried importing cheaper Egyptian natron as an alternative preservative, the Brotherhood spread rumors it was heretical salt that doomed souls to wander. Most brutally, they gave preferential treatment to burying children, ensuring every delayed adult funeral amplified public outrage. Royal ledgers tell the story of surrender. On September 8th, the crown not only rolled back the spice taxes but granted the coffin makers exclusive rights to prepare all royal funerals, a concession worth 10 times their original demands. The victory rippled across Europe. Within months, gravediggers in Ghent and Cologne were copying Parisian tactics. A new power dynamic had been carved into the medieval economy. Cross the undertakers and you'd answer to the unburied. Archaeology confirms the strike's lasting impact. Excavated Parisian graves from 1383 show a sudden shift to simpler shrouds and fewer spices, not because of cost, but as a continued warning from the Brotherhood. Meanwhile, recovered merchant ledgers from Avignon record frantic orders for aromatic herbs to mask urban decay, with one trader noting, "The dead have become the most militant tradesmen of all." The strike's legacy lives on in unexpected places. Modern labor laws about essential services trace back to those medieval debates over whether burial counted as skilled labor or sacred duty. And the next time you see workers walk off the job, remember, the most effective strike in history wasn't in a factory or field, but in the graveyards of Paris, where the dead themselves became bargaining chips. Bologna's medical students didn't just study anatomy, they started trade wars with their scalpels. In 1421, when Hungarian merchants discovered their ancestors' skeletons dangling in the university's dissection halls, they didn't send angry letters. They sent empty wine barrels rolling back across the Alps. The message was clear: if Italy wanted Hungarian silver for its vintages, it would have to stop turning Magyar bones into medical diagrams. What began as a scholarly pursuit of knowledge had escalated into a full-blown economic blockade, proving that in medieval Europe, even the dead could be leveraged for trade concessions. The theft wasn't random. Bologna's medical school, the oldest in Europe, prized Hungarian skeletons for their distinctive osteology. Generations of horseback riding had left telltale grooves in the hip bones, perfect for teaching muscle attachment. But acquiring these specimens legally was nearly impossible. Hungary's strict burial codes required sealed lead coffins, making grave robbing a messy, time-consuming ordeal. So the Italians got creative. They targeted Hungarian merchant cemeteries along trade routes, where traveling nobles were buried in simpler wooden caskets. A bribe to a local sexton here, a midnight excavation there, and soon Bologna's lecture halls were stocked with stolen femurs and vertebrae. Budapest's response was surgical in its precision. Instead of banning all Italian goods which would have hurt Hungarian consumers, they singled out wine, knowing it struck at the heart of Bologna's merchant class. Tuscan vintners, suddenly locked out of their richest market, flooded the university with complaints. Ledgers from the era showed desperate anatomy professors negotiating with wine guilds, offering to return certain acquired specimens if the embargo lifted. But Hungary held firm, demanding not just the bones return, but a public penance. Bologna had to fund a chapel where the disarticulated merchants could be reburied under the gaze of their own saints. The conflict exposed a darker truth about medieval medicine's supply chain. Universities weren't just buying cadavers from executioners or paupers, they were running international smuggling operations. A whistleblower's letter from Padua describes Venetian merchants disguising skeletons as religious relics, packing skulls in barrels of Lenten fish to avoid inspection. Meanwhile, German traders developed a macabre side hustle, selling export-grade corpses preserved in brine to avoid the telltale stench of decay. The Hungarian embargo forced these practices into the light, revealing an anatomy trade as cutthroat as any spice route. Archaeology confirms the scale of this grisly commerce. Excavations near Bologna's old medical quarter uncovered mass graves filled with foreign-style coffins, evidence of a hasty reburial campaign when inspectors came knocking. Meanwhile, Hungarian ossuaries from the period show skeletons reassembled with silver wire, a costly attempt to restore dignity after their Italian ordeal. The most chilling find, a ledger from a Venetian shipping agent listing articulated teaching models alongside bolts of silk and casks of oil, their prices per pound nearly identical. The standoff finally ended through an unlikely mediator, the Pope. Facing pressure from both Catholic nations, Martin V brokered a deal where Bologna would pay Hungary a bone tariff on every foreign skeleton used for study. The funds built a new cemetery in Buda, complete with armed guards to deter future thefts. But the real legacy was in the paperwork. For the first time, medical schools had to document cadaver origins, creating Europe's earliest anatomy import licenses. A Florentine contract from 1443 specifies that a merchant's corpse could only be dissected if he had died in debt to the university, a loophole that kept the supply flowing while paying lip service to ethics. This macabre trade war left its mark on modern medicine. Those donated to science, forms you sign at hospitals. Their lineage traces back to Budapest's wine embargo, when the dead first demanded a say in their own commercial afterlife. And the next time you sip a Chianti, remember, 7 centuries ago, that vintage fate hinged on whether a Hungarian merchant's femur ended up in a barrel or a lecture hall. These forgotten burial disputes reveal a truth far stranger than fiction. The medieval economy didn't just run on gold and silver, but on the unshakable belief that the dead held veto power over the living. Every trade route, every market stall, every ship's manifest existed in the shadow of ancestors who could bless or blight a deal with a ghostly whisper. When empires clashed over funeral rites, they weren't fighting about superstition. They were negotiating the oldest currency of all, trust etched in stone and sealed in graves. Modern commerce might seem light, years removed from these spectral concerns, but look closer. Today's trade wars still turn on invisible rules, unspoken customs, tacit agreements, the unbreakable rhythms of who gets to set the terms. What's a trademark dispute over designer handbags, if not the descendant of Venetian merchants brawling over who owned a saint's bones? Our tariffs and sanctions may lack the drama of cursed relics or haunted harbors, but the principle remains: trade is never just about the goods. It's about whose traditions get to call the shots. The real lesson of these medieval conflicts isn't that people were irrational. It's that they understood something we've forgotten: commerce is a fragile ritual, as dependent on shared belief as any funeral rite. When the Khazars neglected their burial mounds, they didn't just offend the dead. They broke a covenant with the living, the unspoken promise that certain lines wouldn't be crossed. Today's equivalent might be a tech firm violating open source codes or a manufacturer cutting corners on safety inspections. The scale changes, but the stakes feel eerily familiar. So the next time you read about a trade embargo or a shipping delay, ask yourself, what unseen burial customs still dictate the flow of goods? What ancestral agreements are we violating without even realizing it? Because history whispers a warning through these forgotten disputes. When you disturb the graves of tradition, you risk burying your own prosperity. The ghosts of commerce never really leave us. They just change their costumes. Hit subscribe, because the past isn't done teaching us how to navigate the marketplace of the living. And who knows, the next global trade war might just be waiting for someone to misplace a sacred relic or skip a funeral bell. After all, the dead have patience, and they always collect what they're owed. If this glimpse into the dead's role in trade fascinated you, share your thoughts below. Which empire's burial dispute surprised you most? Was it the Khazars, whose neglected grave mounds triggered Byzantine trade wars, or the Venetian merchants who smuggled relics like corporate assets? Maybe the Norse funeral feasts, where a missed toast could collapse entire amber routes, left you stunned. These weren't just cultural quirks. They were the hidden wiring of medieval commerce, where a single misstep in ritual could bankrupt kingdoms. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories where history's shadows shape our world. Behind every like button is a saga waiting to be told. Whether it's the Baltic traders who auctioned burial plots like stock shares, or the Genos who turned coffins into contraband pipelines. Your engagement helps resurrect these forgotten conflicts, one algorithm nudge at a time. The past isn't dead, it's just waiting to be unearthed. Who knows what other economic ghosts are lurking in the archives? Maybe next time we'll dig up how tombstone inscriptions became medieval Yelp reviews, or why graveyard weeds sparked textile revolutions. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss when history's skeletons rattle their chains again. After all, in the marketplace of the dead, every subscriber is another candle lit in the catacombs of curiosity.